The Unabomber, or Ted Kaczynski, believed that modern technology has been a disaster for the human race that has caused not only widespread damage to the natural world, but has also spread psychological suffering worldwide, and that technology has made life unfulfilling in every aspect that it touches. And he believed that a massive restructuring of society was necessary to put things back on a simpler order. And his personal solution was to build himself a remote cabin out in Montana where there was no electricity and no running water, and he fed himself pretty much as a hunter-gatherer would. And to help the world get on board with restructuring society, his plan was, or what he did was, send bombs to people and places that he felt were symbolic of the technological world. His bombing campaign started in 1978 and lasted up until he was arrested in 1995. Now, some people might say Kaczynski's problem was more related to paranoid schizophrenia than it was to alienation, and maybe that's true. But whatever his mental illness, it certainly seems plausible that alienation contributed to it. Anyway, in this book that was in Kaczynski's cabin, this book called Growing Up Absurd, the author Paul Goodman wrote the following about the damaging effects of alienation. It is hard to grow up when there isn't enough man's work. There is nearly full employment, but there get to be fewer jobs that are necessary or unquestionably useful. To produce necessary food and shelter is man's work. During most of economic history, most men have done this drudging work, secure that it was justified and worthy. Once we turn away from the absolutely necessary subsistence jobs, however, we find that an enormous proportion of our production is not even unquestionably useful. If there is nothing worthwhile, it is hard to do anything at all. When one does nothing, one is threatened by the question, is one nothing? Now, I also have my own criticism of Goodman's criticism, but I'm going to get to that later, and mostly when I get to discussing my book's 6th chapter. For now, I'm just going to read a quote from my last social critic, Henry David Thoreau. In Life Without Principle, Thoreau wrote, "Cold and hunger seem more friendly to my nature than those methods which men have adopted to ward them off." Now, I like Thoreau's quote because it does a good job at capturing how alienating and distasteful Thoreau finds the industrial world. But I'm just not sure he meant it literally, because cold and hunger, well, those are just very, very unfriendly to human nature. Maybe he meant that he'd rather suffer mild cold and hunger than work some stupid day job. Anyway, alienation, one drawback of the modern workday, and I'm going to briefly discuss 2 more. All right, the second drawback on my list comes from the way that our expectations shift when we live in a society overflowing with goods and services. Given that there's so much available in terms of an endless number of electronic gadgets and luxury versions of our food and clothes and shelter and our vehicles and vacations and so on, that means there's that much more to desire. And that can give us that much more of a margin for feeling deprived when we see others who have more than we do. And to further complicate this perception of deprivation issue, there's the problem that our expectations are very adjustable, meaning that a jump in our salaries, or jump in our income anyway, doesn't necessarily alleviate this perception of deprivation. Because when our salaries rise, our expectations rise too. So any initial happiness that we might gain from having more money and more possessions doesn't necessarily last. All right, there's lots more to be said on that subject too, but I'm going to explore that more when I get to discussing my book's 5th chapter, a chapter called More versus Enough. All right, the last drawback I'm going to discuss, which, like the last one, could be seen as a blessing with drawbacks, is our wide range of work options. Now, it seems like it should be a purely liberating experience to be free from the old tradition of being forced to inherit your parents' occupation. But on the other hand, having an abundance of career opportunities also gives us an abundance of opportunities for failure. And this problem is aggravated by the way we link our employment to our very identity. Now, we're less likely to worry about bare survival the way our ancestors did, but this opens up the luxury to be stressed about a number of psychological problems. Now, maybe no accident that the field of psychiatry arose shortly after the Industrial Revolution. Maybe this was because the Industrial Revolution gave us that much more to be neurotic about. That being said, for me, I feel the advantages of today's specialist-saturated world go a long way in making up for the disadvantages. Even though I agree that social critics have some legitimate points about the way we're alienated from our labor and the way that our abundance of job opportunities and abundance of goods and services can make us neurotic, Still, I will gladly accept the manageable risks of neurosis and alienation in exchange for the great benefits of our modern work system. Because I feel like we should not take wonderful phenomenons like well-stocked supermarket shelves and polio vaccinations and the internet for granted. These are not things that could ever come about spontaneously in nature or possibly come about through the efforts of isolated one-person operations. Benefits like these come about only through our complex and interwoven, neurotic modern workday of alienated specialists. I also feel like many of the admittedly genuine problems that stem from our modern workday are, in fact, manageable. And management of these problems will be the subject of my next 2 video series, which is where I'll be discussing the last 2 chapters of my book. And for those who haven't watched my earlier videos, that book is called Hunting, Gathering, and Video Games. Looks like this. Okay, thank you for watching.